Hello, and welcome to Spotlight On, the podcast that brings together business leaders, entrepreneurs, and experts covering a range of topics. I'm Nicholas Barton, founder and CEO of the Barton Partnership. We're an award-winning executive recruitment and consulting solutions firm providing permanent search and independent consulting services across strategy, sustainability and M&A, data and analytics, and transformation and change. Today I've got the pleasure of talking to Luke Jensen. Luke is an established retail leader with a wealth of experience in the global food industry and is currently the executive chair at Hana Group. Hana is a world-leading provider of fresh, on-the-go sushi and Pan-Asian cuisine. In his previous roles, Luke has served as the CEO of Ocado Solution, where he led the transformation of Ocado from a UK retail company to a recognised global technology business. He was Group Director of Strategy at Sainsbury's, where he's responsible for online and all customer-facing digital activities. His consulting pedigree stems from BCG, where more recently he served as a senior advisor in the retail and consumer practice and was a core member of BCG's Global Consumer Digital Task Force. And lastly, OC&C, where he was partner and head of retail and consumer practice. Luke was previously non-exec director at ASOS as well. Luke, it's great to have you today. Thanks for joining me on this podcast. Really looking forward to this discussion, actually. We've known each other a while, obviously. It's been a while since we were last in touch, but since the days when you were at Sainsbury's and we were supporting you there. Perhaps if you could start by giving us an overview of your career journey.
A career journey. I'll try to do this fast, but actually I'll slow things down from the off. It's probably worth explaining how I got to OC&C because my first job was in banking. I spent my first few years and then I decided to do an MBA. And the reason I decided that was I just felt the learning curve was not long enough in banking and that I was probably not going to have a career that would fit my own aspirations. So I went and did an MBA at INSEAD. I decided strategy consulting looked exciting, fun, varied. But the one thing that I guess I was not that excited about by some of the bigger firms was they were very established institutions. And I guess one of my motivations has always been around participating in building a business. And one of the things that was interesting about OC&C at the time is that it was still a small firm, very much in the making, where it felt like I was going to be able to participate in actually building the firm rather than just do interesting consulting work. But they also had great clients. And so I surprised some of my contemporaries because I had some offers from the more obvious strategy, and I decided not to take those and to go to OC&C. And it turned out to be a great choice because OC&C at the time was already big in retail, but was relatively varied. It was retail and consumer, but it gave me the opportunity to start helping shape the business. And one of the things I led as even before I was a partner, as a principal, was starting to do work for private equity, which was new at the time. So at the time when private equity firms bought a business, they'd do legal DD, they'd do obviously accounting DD, but they did not do what has become a staple, which is strategic due diligence, really understanding the market context, competitive context of the business. And so I was involved in leading the setup of that as a practice and defining really what it was we were doing. OC&C has been very successful. I was also in the meantime doing a lot of consumer and retail work, and I became a partner quite fast. I became a partner after 4 years post MBA. Really, it was a fantastic time, great group of people. But I guess at that point, got myself in a bit of a place where I was saying, do I see myself being a consultant for the rest of my career? And actually coming back to my theme of building businesses, kind of wanted to apply myself more directly to building businesses. So I left OC&C for the first time, because I actually left OC&C twice in my career. Sure. I left OC&C for the first time to become an entrepreneur. It was .com days around 96-ish, where I left and set up a business called bettercaring.com that was the first UK national database of care homes in the UK that local authorities could plug into. We set that up. Our funding shareholder then had change of heart, so we sold the business, made a bit of money, then got into .com consumer businesses with Green Fingers, Think Natural and Pet Planet in Scotland. And for 3 years, I was in this entrepreneurial mode, which taught me a lot. It's a lot harder than you think. You go into it, and I think the whole .com era has probably exacerbated that, the whole tech era, but you go into it thinking either you're going to fail spectacularly or you're going to become a billionaire. You don't really think of the middle outcomes. Truth is, life is a bell curve, and in the main, you land somewhere in the middle. And so over the course of 3 years, we built a business that ended up having 120 employees, was making 30 million of turnover, was not making money, but not losing money. At that point, I thought, okay, how is this going to work for me? And we had a choice between raising more money to try to do acquisitions and build something bigger, which was actually my inclination. I had two business partners and they were more inclined to just say, hey, let's just run what we've got and try to do a good job of it, which at that point in time I found less exciting a prospect. And it so happened that I'd stayed on good terms with OC&C. They happened to ask me at that point in time whether I wanted to come back and run the consumer practice, the consumer and retail practice. So I decided to do that. So I went back to OC&C, period of growth, period where we were growing internationally, which I found very exciting. The prospect of building a firm to rival some of the big players in the industry. And so I really had my head down doing that. Obviously, from time to time, people from your profession come knocking and say, hey, would you consider this? A headhunter came knocking once and said, strategy director at Sainsbury's. My reaction was immediately, there's one job I'll never do, is strategy director in a company, because if you're going to do strategy, you're much better off being the partner from OC&C or McKinsey, because you've actually got more influence. You've got more influence on the CEO than the strategy director usually does. So my reaction was then, I'm not interested. But then they said, oh, but yeah, meet Justin King. And so Justin King was 18 months into the turnaround of Sainsbury's that had gone from being number one. Most people of our lifetime don't remember that, but sometime back in the 80s, Sainsbury's was ahead of Tesco in the UK. Then a lot of things had gone wrong at Sainsbury's, and Justin King had come in 2 years before and was in the process of conducting a very successful turnaround of the business. And so the headhunter said, hey, meet Justin. So I met Justin. It was an interesting conversation, because the thing is, because I didn't want the job. And so it actually made it quite nice to go to a job interview where you don't want the job. I met Justin and we got on well and had a very good conversation about the substance of the business and what was going on at Sainsbury's, because what was interesting is they'd sort of ticked all the first 2 years of boxes of just fixing everything that was wrong. But of course, once you've fixed everything that's wrong, you start going in the mode of, okay, well, where are we going to go? And that was why strategy was suddenly coming up the agenda versus operational fixing. And so we had a good conversation about the business. And then I told him, I said, listen, I'm not interested in this job. But by the way, if you want somebody of the caliber that you're telling me you're looking for, the job needs to report to you rather than report to the CFO. The job needs to be on the operating board. And by the way, if somebody like me were taking that job, they would only do it on the basis that they're going to get a big operational job out of it sometime shortly after, rather than be strategy director forever. The next day, the headhunter called me back and said, okay, well, Justin has agreed with everything you've said. Would you like to join on that basis? Within 12 months, I moved on from being strategy director to running the non-food business, which was a £2 billion business, clothing, general merchandise, entertainment, run quite distinctly from the core food business. So we had our own head office in Coventry and sourcing infrastructure in Asia. And that was a great opportunity. And I think the reason why Justin gave me that opportunity was not because there'd been any promises at the time of recruiting, because at the time of recruiting, he'd actually quite explicitly said, fine about your aspiration to have an operational job, but you will only get that job if we feel at the time that you're fit for that job. That was well understood. So circumstances made that it did work and happen. And I think that was a great opportunity for transition for me into a first real general management job. And it was great. I really enjoyed it. This is more like the kind of thing I want to do in life rather than consultant or an advisor. Then that morphed into a job called Group Development Director, where I had grocery online, I had the online business, I had the various growth businesses that we were building, including evaluating plans for expansion abroad. And it was a fun and interesting time. And that takes us up to 2014. And I know you mentioned, as we were chatting offline before this recording, that you were going to ask me about the accident that changed my time.
Well, we'll come on to that because it's really quite a pivotal moment. But before we get to that point, and before we move to Ocado and where you are today, the transition you made from strategy into a P&L focused role. Just talk about that. How did you find that transition? Obviously, you had previously run a business, so it wasn't completely alien to you. But obviously, this is a different kettle of fish from starting up your own company to walking into an established P&L within an organization, etc. Going from strategy to line management, running a business, and how smooth was that transition for you?
First, I think it was immensely helpful that I had done my entrepreneurial activities because you need to develop an empathy for the fact that when you are actually doing, a lot of things go wrong and a lot of things go off plan. Whereas when you're advising, you're generally advising around, here's the true north and what a good course of action looks like. And then you're not really the person who's dealing with all the deviations and everything that goes along the way. So I think having that sensitivity to understanding things go wrong, and a lot of what general management is actually about dealing with all the things that go wrong rather than setting the direction for what goes right. Interesting about the transition is in terms of leadership style. When you're in an environment like a consulting firm, you're leading small numbers of people who are very similar to you. Whereas when suddenly you're running a P&L in a large business, very diverse groups of people who are different from you, have different levels of education, different motivation, different types of smarts, different experience, actually trying to figure out how to do that well is a steep learning curve. And it was super interesting for me because I realized quickly, for example, when first week, you stand on the stump and you've got the people at the Coventry office who out of the 700, like 350 people in a room, and you're talking to them and you can see instinctively what they're responding to, and you realize, I'd come in with a style that was probably a little bit university lecturer, kind of explaining how things are going to work. And then when you start saying, hey, great, and what were the 5 top product for sales last week, then suddenly you're getting light in people's eyes. So you have to learn fast because you have to adapt, and you realize that you're good at certain things. I knew because I'd done so much thinking about business. I'm good at seeing around corners, good at that kind of stuff. But managing large, diverse groups of people is not something I've done. So, you have to be confident because leadership in large organizations is about confidence, but you have to be humble at the same time. Always recognize that success is going to be about getting the most out of the group of people who are actually making business happen day in, day out. And they may not respond to the same things you would naturally respond to. And you need to figure out what they're going to respond to, what's going to drive their motivation, how to get the best out of them. And so that was a steep but super exciting learning curve.
And then from Sainsbury's, then let's talk about that. So the next move.
It was New Year's Eve 2013-14. I'm on holiday at my place in France, and we were building a guest cottage, and I decided to go and visit the building site. There were no builders around, so it was 31st of December. I hasten to add that it was early afternoon, so I was perfectly sober. But I decide rather foolishly to, where there's a ground floor and a first floor, but there was no staircase. I stick a ladder on the edge of the hole and go up and visit upstairs, and it all looks good. I'm very pleased with myself. And then I put a foot on the ladder and I just go flying down as the ladder slips away. And effectively, my leg just went straight through my pelvis. My pelvis split into 5 distinct parts, and I was lying there on the floor for a period of time, writhing in pain before a neighbor, because my wife couldn't hear me because she was at the other end in the main house, before neighbor heard. And so this is on an island off the coast in Brittany, so it's not a nice little place to have life-threatening accidents. But I get helicoptered to the mainland, in the hospital on the mainland. Don't know at this point, life risk, that you get over in 24 hours, fine, I'm going to survive. You then don't know whether you're going to walk again. So, you need a few more days to figure out the answer to that question. And meantime, you're lying there in a hell of a lot of pain. And After 10 days or so, I was flown back into the UK and put in hospital in the UK, by which time it was clear that I should, in principle, recover. That was the good news. The bad news is that I was probably going to spend an estimated 3 months in hospital and have an estimated 6 months rehab after. So now, behind the scenes, back at the ranch at Sainsbury's, there was a big change happening because Justin, who'd been CEO for 10 years, circumstances came to a point where it was decided he was going to leave. So Justin came to see me at the hospital and said, "Hey, I'm leaving." Between the fumes of the morphine that I was injected with, we kind of had okay, what does it mean for me? Because there was a bit of politics going on in Sainsbury's, and without going into too many gory details, they were camps. I had been Camp Justin, and the new camp was not my camp, put it that way. So Justin basically said, I'm going to be leaving. You probably want to think about doing your exit at the same time. And indeed, a few conversations later, it was clear that was the right choice to do. But it wasn't a choice that I had willingly chose to make because I had no other choice, put it that way. Having always had a career where you've got the next job of your choice, done everything, things have always been easy, win, win, win. Suddenly find yourself unemployed on a hospital bed, lengthy rehab ahead of you. It was definitely a challenging time, obviously. But interestingly, in retrospect, when I look back at it now, 10 years later, actually having that interruption, not being in win mode and having a big loss dumped at your door is actually quite helpful at times in life. It resets you. It makes you recognize that you're not in control. That's actually quite helpful at times.
How long did it take you to find that optimism when you're lying there and you're having that conversation? And obviously, he's left, you've processed, discussed, I'm sure, with family. How quickly did it take you to find that positive point of reference in your mind?
Interesting. My first reflex was I need to go and find quickly a full-time job equivalent to what I was doing or better, get myself a CEO job of a mid-sized company. That was kind of my focus in my mind. But the problem is that you're sitting there saying, okay, I need to go to physio every day, even after 3 months, and I get out crutches, having to go to physio every day. Not ideal to go and do job interviews and for people to say, hey, this is the CEO we want. He's on crutches and we're not sure for how long. So I had that disconnect between what I thought I wanted to do and a realistic set of circumstances that I was dealing with. That time worked out quite well because what happened is I thought, okay, well, I want to do some work. I got back in touch with particularly some of the people I knew in private equity and started doing some consulting on deals in private equity. Did work for Advent, for KKR, for Apax, etc. Looking at deals, and they're interested in having advisors who could potentially then become part of the management solution for the business if they buy it. So it was a good way of getting myself back into a rhythm of things. And actually, it also made me realize, actually, you know what? There are other ways of doing things than having one full-time mega job and having portfolio of activities. And one of the firms that I met asked me to join the board of Hana Group at that time. So I bought, although I've only been executive chairman for a year, board, which was fun. I then knew some people at BCG. They asked me to become a senior advisor in the retail practice at BCG internationally, which again was fun and exciting. Over the space of 12, 18 months as I was recovering, I built myself a portfolio of activity, which actually was feeling quite good and exciting and interesting. I was then in a much more serene mode versus what the hell can the next 20 years of my career look like, because I had a base, reasonable earnings, and doing interesting stuff. And therefore, I knew it wasn't necessarily what I wanted to do forever, be in that mode. It gave me time and opportunity to see what's going on out there. Talking with people and networking, that's another important thing, I think, for me, a lesson of that time, is that I did the effort, because it's an effort, even if you're a sociable person, it's an effort to pick up your phone, reach out to people who you know more or less well and say, let's meet up for coffee, for lunch, for whatever, and just, chat and explore about things. Because what you quickly realize is opportunities sometimes come to you out of the blue. A headhunter calls you up and says, hey, do you want this? And then it happens. But a lot of the time, opportunities are created by you. You go and talk to people, find things, and sometimes without even knowing it, you're setting in train the conversation that's going to lead to something. And that was indeed the case with one of the people I caught up with from time to time. It was Tim Steiner and Group CEO of Ocado. And we met up with absolutely no agenda. I'd met him because before Ocado floated, they'd done the usual reviewing your strategic options that included whether a trade buyer may acquire the business. And obviously, Sainsbury's would have looked at it at a time like most of the other big retailers. And at the time I'd met him the first time around, I didn't really believe in the Ocado model. They'd built one big warehouse. To make money, they had to fill it completely, by which time they'd have to build a second very big warehouse. And you kind of thought, it's never going to make cash. I was of a view that it was never quite going to work. But interesting, then I'd found myself running the grocery online business at Sainsbury's that was following the traditional model of picking in store and preparing in store. And you kind of, when you're running that, you quickly realize that that's never going to work in the long run as the winning model for grocery online, because basically, grocery is a 3% margin business. You spend all the money to get the product through a supply chain to the back of the store, to the shelf of the store. And then you need to go and spend the money to have a picker run around the store to prepare the order and then ship it to someone's home. And, it's just, if you pretend that all the costs are sunk and that everything is already spent, then you can claim you're making some money. But if you start thinking of it as saying, this could be 20% of my business, then you say, oh shit, I'm never going to make money with that model. And so I remained intrigued by the Ocado model. And I met Tim, and Tim said, I need to show you our newest warehouse. It was a new warehouse, which instead of having £1 billion worth of sales capacity was a third of that. So you start thinking, okay, that's already a lot more modular. And it was based on this complete reinvention. Instead of having kilometers of conveyors with an order going all the way through a warehouse, it was these robots moving on the top of a grid. And the beauty of that is that it meant that even if the warehouse was not doing 300 million of sales full capacity, was only doing 150 million, you could just put in half the robots, have the facility running efficiently. So suddenly I'm thinking, Tim has actually solved the lifelong problem that had not been solved before. It was also the time where Ocado had built a great business, retail business in the UK, great but small, had spent a lot of money on getting to this technology. And therefore, it was quite clear and obvious that the only way to get a payback on that extent of technology spend was to go and exploit the technology elsewhere. And the business had already come to the conclusion that trying to set up Ocado retail businesses in other countries was just going to be too hard, too difficult. And therefore, it was about taking the technology and bringing it to other retailers. And they'd started trying to do that and had not yet succeeded, with the exception of Morrison's in the UK, but they hadn't yet succeeded internationally. Tim and I are basically having coffee at some point, and it sort of becomes reasonably obvious that with my background of retail, having run a grocery online business in a traditional retailer, my background as a consultant, so knowing how to talk to CEOs of retail businesses, they had this great technology, but they didn't really know how to talk it to a grocery retailer. And so it was this light bulb moment, I think, that Tim and I had both simultaneously, which was, hey, shit, I have to come and go and work for Ocado, and him saying, you have to come and work for Ocado. It's a kind of interesting story to illustrate what I was saying before, that sometimes you create the jobs that turn out to be great jobs.
The placements that we have made, I would say at least 40% of those have come from setting up conversations for two people where there wasn't a vacancy, but we know, look, this is a good individual with a great background, and I know you're doing some interesting stuff. You two should meet for a coffee. And invariably, things come as a result of that. Not every placement we make as a company is finding someone for a a defined search, a defined mandate. So I couldn't agree more, actually. And that's a fantastic story. Tell us about where you are today then.
I made a change just under a year ago. Basically, I'd been nearly 7 years at Ocado. We built Ocado Solutions into the global tech leader in its space, with business in the US, Canada, Japan, Korea, Australia, Sweden, France, Spain, Poland. We're getting to a point in the cycle of both what we were trying to do and what our clients were doing, where grocery online, after a big boost of growth with COVID, had sort of had a drop off post COVID. So the market was quieter. And so the focus now was less on continuing to expand the business in the short term, but was really on much more grinding work with our partners around the world to help them operationalize all the technology that we'd put at their disposal. And I guess I found myself personally in a situation where I know this about myself. I'm an expansion person, and so I'm more happy and motivated when I'm in expansion mode. And we were at that point going to be less in expansion mode. It was a slight curse of having had the great success of signing these contracts around the world with all these retailers, was that they kind of wanted me to turn up every 6 weeks everywhere. When you've got 4 countries where you're doing that, it's fine. When you're spread from Australia to Canada, it becomes more difficult. In some ways, only a transition was going to allow to break that a bit. So I was at a point where I love Ocado and I had a fantastic time and it's an awesome business. But I think I had done what I was really going to do there. I did not have the drive and motivation that I'd had for the first 6-7 years. I was ripe for change. And it so happened, so I'd been on the board of, I mentioned, Hana Group for many years, and Hana had changed ownership to Permira a few years back, great private equity firm. It so happens that in parallel with me saying, okay, I think I've done my bit at Ocado, in conversations with Permira and with the team at Hana, they came out saying, hey, Luke, how could you be more involved in the business in a more hands-on role? And so we defined a role of executive chair as a 3-day-a-week, kind of 60% of my time role. I thought, you know what, I can do that. It fits exactly where I want to be. Great CEO in the business, running the operation. So I'm not trying to replace the CEO. I'm going to be an exec chair working on growth, helping build the senior team, helping organize the senior team. So it really felt like, again, good timing. Again, it's a job that didn't exist before. So a bit like CEO of Ocado Solutions, the job didn't exist before I did it. Executive chair at Hana Group did not exist. There was a non-exec chair previously. But the timing was right for the business and the timing was right for me. So I decided to make that change. I've added along the way a couple of non-executive positions. So I'm a non-exec director at the Co-op. Fascinating organization. You could do a whole podcast on just them. And also, in a slightly off-piste manner, I've become a non-executive director of NS&I, National Savings and Investments, the government savings bank, where their interest in me was they're doing a big tech transformation, completely replatforming the business to be a much more digital first business, but also recasting a whole bunch of very big contracts with third-party suppliers. And so obviously my experience of digital transformation was going to be highly relevant. The last 9 months have felt quite full-time, but with a different focus from the grind of 7-day a week. And so right now it's suiting me pretty well.
The evolution of the Ocado technology, is that still very much at its early stages even now when you think about, how organizations will continue to evolve?
I mean, I think one of the things with Ocado is that, like quite a lot of tech businesses, it would not exist if it weren't for the sheer force of will of one individual, and that individual is Tim Steiner in the case of Ocado. Yeah, you need a degree of both vision but also stubbornness to just say, I'm going to build something that nobody has built before. And I'm going to try to solve a problem that nobody has solved before. Tim and the business have been single-mindedly focused on solving consumers want grocery online, ordered online, delivered to their homes, and that is going to grow, and it's going to continue to grow. It's probably never going to go to, the way of home electronics, which has basically largely disappeared from shops altogether. Talk to somebody like Rodney McMullen, the CEO of Kroger in the US, he will say that it's likely to become 20-25% of the business. It becomes a very big problem to solve. The basic way retailers are approaching it, as I was mentioning earlier, around the world, which is send a bunch of colleagues around the store to pick orders from the shelves, is not a good solution because it is a profit dilutive solution. And ultimately, if something's going to be 25% of your business, you need it to make as much money as your base business. Otherwise, you're just digging a hole for yourself. So Tim set out to solve a problem in a novel way nobody had gone for, and he has continued to invest to stay ahead. So it's number one with this technology. And what I brought to the party was to say, how do you actually translate what is a technology you've built for yourself, because it was built for Ocado UK, into something that is actually going to work for other retailers. And the starting point is understanding those other retailers, because there's a natural arrogance to tech that says you're going to walk into a meeting and just tell the retailer, hey, you bunch of idiots, you're doing it the wrong way. The solution, we're great. Look at us, how smart we are. Human beings do not particularly respond well to that approach. Need to approach it with sympathy and empathy for what people are thinking on the other side of the table, understand their language, understand how they're thinking about it, and then to start to adapt the technology to those retailers. Because initially the Ocado technology was built more on the basis that you were going to turn up in a retailer that didn't have an online business and you'd suddenly deliver them this out-of-the-box online business. But by the time we were in the market, everybody already had a sizable online business. So you were going to have to deal one way or another with a transition from existing assets, whether it's the software, hardware assets, onto the new platform. And that's a whole other business to deal with, that management of transition and transformation. What's great about it is it's so engaging and so strategic and such a big investment for the retailers you're working with that you're having a day in, day out conversation with the CEO of that retailer, because their company is at stake in doing this. It does mean also that you have to create a bunch of resources against it that I think as a tech business, Ocado's assumption was, well, they'll just take the tech and it works great and it's fine. And no, that's not how it works. Not only does the business need to adapt to the tech, but the tech needs to adapt to the business. We built a fantastic team of people around the world, not just selling the solution. Once you've sold the solution, that feels hard and it's great and you've got the deal and you've won and you feel fantastic, but actually then making it work for the retailers, you're just starting the journey at that point, even just looking at the physical hardware side of it. Building highly complex warehouses in geographies with diverse regulatory environments. Japan, earthquakes, suddenly you need to have a warehouse that can wobble. And that's a whole other challenge. And so it's a great case study of both the power of really pursuing technology leadership in one particular area, but then of how we built solutions, how you adapt that technology to make it work for retailers. There's no doubt in my mind that today there's a lot of upside in that business because it still has uniquely the best solution to solve a very, very complex problem. And the fact that it's taking a bit more time for the retailers that Ocado is working with to fully exploit the technology is a matter of time. And of course, time does cost money, but it's a matter of time rather than a matter of, is this still the right solution? Like most things, again, in life, it's not about 100% success or 100% failure. It's about all the hard yards that come somewhere in the middle between the two.
Are you still an optimist when it comes to the physical side of the retail market?
I think what everybody's found, and that's very confirmed, is the two go hand in hand in the sense that your best customers do want to shop you multi-channel. And invariably in every single sector where you've got shops and online and social engagement also, you find that the more touch points you have, the more you do with those customers. So the world will be omni-channel and stores will continue to have a role. That said, I think it's critical to recognize that in any retail sector, as you move beyond 10, 20% online, the stores start having a real challenge of being overspaced and overmanned. I think you have to be ahead of the curve, thinking what space requirements you're going to have. So you're better off doing it early rather than late. Retailers have had to respond to the challenge of eroding store sales by cutting back on labor in store, optimizing everything in the store. But one of the results of that is that stores have become less lively places. And then you're in danger of being in a spiral where people have less reasons to go to the stores, because once you close down your butchery counter, people say, well, I'm just online. Fresh sushi in store is a great example of something that brings something very unique to the store, because it's super fresh, made daily, thrown away overnight. So it actually doesn't lend itself particularly well to online selling, but it's great for the store experience. It's a fantastic product, and that's why retailers love it. So I think there are ways of rethinking retail space. Why has Next been so successful as a retailer consistently to the clothing market is they were very early in thinking of that transition and of managing retail space. And no doubt there are a lot of Next stores that has disappeared, but we've managed not to notice it because they've run their transition sufficiently smartly that, they're now predominant online business, and they've managed to do that very profitably. So it is absolutely feasible, but it is about heading into the problem rather than attempting to refuse it, which I think is key to success.
One last question to finish on. When we think about the significant sort of evolution of technology, especially AI and data becoming sort of so integral now in retail and consumer sectors, what are you seeing as major trends and use cases around those technologies, and perhaps other technologies that are driving the sector going forward?
I think for me, the biggest one in consumer retail is going towards what I call, the segment of one, as in being able to understand your customers well enough, having the means to engage with them in terms of pricing, promotional activities, etc., that you can actually be doing something for Nick that is different from what you're doing for Luke. It requires having access to the data, which retailers are getting to. So you now have, if you take grocery, for example, Clubcard, Nectar, etc., have been around for a long time. But one of the reasons why in the last couple of years they've introduced very specific, more aggressive pricing for card holders is to basically finish driving up the level of card participation to a point where you're trending towards nearly 100% of your business being carded. Now, why is that important? It's because if it's carded, it's recorded, and you start knowing what people are doing and how they're behaving. And it does not take a big leap of the imagination to have very individually targeted promos. So today, in the main, most retailers will still have a portfolio of a handful of promos where effectively segments are created. Either they're static segments or they're reshuffled depending on what you're trying to do, but they're still segments, to a point where you can, with AI, analyze vast amounts of data well enough that you can literally be creating the promotions by AI rather than having individuals saying, hey, this week we're going to do this much on tomatoes or whatever. And you could even imagine that then you're trading them with the suppliers on platforms that are AI platforms, a bit like programmatic advertising, for example. So I think there's an enormous potential there to both improve customer experience, because targeting is good for customers, because you'll get more of what you want. Because today, when a business does a promo, they're ending up giving away quite a lot of unneeded money. Whereas if they're really tickling what you want, and obviously it's a way of being much smarter and more profitable for businesses. So to me, that, along with the continuing shift online and what it means for store experience, are the two things that are going to define the next 20 years of consumer and retail.
What a great way to end. And Luke, thank you for your time today. There's so much more we could talk about for another hour, I'm sure, but I'm mindful of your time. But listen, thank you for your time today. Thank you for taking us through your journey.
Thank you very much, and you're very welcome. Always interesting to chat about the future of the world.
Absolutely. Have a good day. Thank you.